Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We'll just take a few seconds here to let folks drift in and get connected to the audio here in the Zoom. Feel free to say hello in the chat while we're waiting. But we are here for My Jewish Learning's weekly Torah study. Hopefully, that's what you are here for as well. Our presenter this morning is going to be Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. I don't have her bio handy, but I do have links to her website and her Substack, which I will drop in the chat in just a moment. But without further ado, I give you Rabbi Lauren Tuchman.
You so much, Ben, and Lag BaOmer Sameach, everyone. For those of you who are still in a place in the world where it is Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, I'm just going to mention that it's Lag BaOmer. We're not going to do anything with that today. We're going to be looking at the Parashat of Emor, but I just wanted to name that that's also happening. And actually, because Emor includes the instructions for counting the Omer, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about Leviticus chapter 23 today, which I'm going to invite Ben to please screen share. And the way to work in today's Parsha study is I'm going to speak a little bit, and I'm going to invite folks as I am speaking to actually read the chapter on your own as I'm speaking, or you can listen to me and read the chapter a little bit later on, whichever you prefer. The reason for that is because we are going to be covering the entire chapter, and it is such a long chapter that I don't think it makes sense for us in the time that we have allotted this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are, to spend that time going through chapter. So as I'm speaking, you are welcome to look at that chapter. And I'm going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive into one of my favorite subjects, which is Jewish liturgy. Because of the nature of this chapter, Parashat Emor is Leviticus chapters 21 through 25, and it spans an incredible amount, chapters 21 through 24, and it spans a lot of ground. And so as such, we get everything from Kohanim and who is and who is not to who is and who is not able to serve in particular roles. I really commend to everyone's attention on that issue Rabbi Dr. Julia Wetz-Belser's work. Strongly recommend if you're interested in issues around that, especially in Leviticus 21. And then in Leviticus 22, we have some conversation around animals and similar parallel to 21. Those are challenging chapters, and there's a lot that's been written on it and a lot that needs to be written on it. And that's not our area for today. So I'm just naming all of that. And I also have a few things that I've written over the years on it, which are on my website. So all of that is very much available for you if you want to be learning more about the opening chapters of Emor. But today we're going to be focusing on the calendar. And Leviticus 23 is a really key chapter in helping us understand our liturgical calendar. What's really interesting about this chapter is that it kind of has two parallel calendar recountings, which different scholars have different understandings of, like how do different sources come together to create the chapter. We're going to just note that, and then we're going to put it to the side just as an area of exploration, but not necessarily of exploration for this moment. One other thing I do want to mention before I go further, we are going to be really using the chat function today for interaction. So Ben is going to be monitoring the chat. Thank you so much, Ben, for doing that. And I'm going to be pausing more frequently to invite comments to be read from the chat. So we're going to be really working with the chat today as a way of getting as many of your comments out there as possible, rather than raised hands. We're going to really focus on chat. So just letting folks know that that's going to be our means of writing in today, and we'll see how that goes. So, great. So Leviticus chapter 23. I'll say a few things about this chapter broadly, and then we'll kind of talk about a few of the specifics of it. This is a recounting of the calendar, specifically thinking about the Moadim, the pilgrimage festivals, but not only, because as we'll see, we will be introduced to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as well. And what's really interesting here is that this chapter kind of comes in the latter portion of a book of Torah that up until now has been almost exclusively. I mean, one could argue that Parshiot, Acharimot, and Kadoshim, which we read last week, deviate from this a little bit, but in large measure, Leviticus is a text that is all about priestly conduct and particular kinds of avodah, particular kinds of service that the priests would do. So now we're moving from that into this place of getting a calendar recounting. And this calendar applies to the entire people. This is not only about the priests, this is about how the Israelites structure our calendar, our religious observances. And we're not really told why we do the things we do in this particular chapter. There are lots of other sections in Torah where that's elucidated. This text, because it is the calendar, is liturgically used multiple times a year, depending on where you are, both in the Jewish world and in terms of your community's practices. So, if you are part of a Jewish community outside of the land of Israel that keeps 2 days of the pilgrimage festivals, so the pilgrimage festivals being Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, if you are a member of community that observes 2 days of what's known as Yom Tov. This Torah portion, this chapter is read at least, by my count, at least, I want to say 3 or 4 times in the course of pilgrimage festivals. This is the reading for the first 2 days of Sukkot, as well as the reading for the second day of Passover. And if you are in a Jewish community, either inside the land of Israel or outside of the land of Israel, that only keeps one day of Yom Tov, then this Torah portion shows up as the reading for the first day of Sukkot. And that is interesting in that fact because this Torah portion, this chapter, talks a lot about Sukkot and what we are to do on Sukkot. And so it's an interesting thing to think about why the rabbi specifically chose this chapter, but I wonder, and I imagine that it has to do with the fact that this is a chapter that elucidates all of these sacred occasions. What's really interesting, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is that we have Pesach offering, we have the observance of Pesach, and then move into an understanding of counting the Omer and what one would bring each of these days of counting. Because we're now at a time where we don't have the temple anymore. And so, because of that, the Omer has become something that sometimes is called a zecher, which is a remembrance. It used to be a wave offering, an actual barley offering that was brought every day. And then Shavuot being the festival of first fruits, Chag HaBikurim, it's often known as. Some people in my world jokingly call it as the big Chametz fest of the year because it's the big wheat harvest. So you'd bring all this barley from what we began to count as the 16th of Nisan through the 5th of Sivan. But in the actual text of this chapter, the Omer is referred to as you start counting after the Shabbat, which is why after the first, let me actually take a look at my text here. After the day of rest is the first day. So Sunday would always be the first day of the Omer, which is why in Karaite Judaism, that is how the Omer is counted. It is not counted from the second night of Pesach. The rabbinic view is that when the Torah here talks about counting after the day of rest, the Shabbaton, it's referring to the first day of Pesach. Rather, the Karaites actually read that literally. The Karaites are Jews who do not accept the authority of the Talmud and of rabbinic literature. And often they came out of a lot of different spaces, but they really began to flourish, I believe, in the eighth and the ninth centuries of the Common Era. Still exists today. There are a couple of Karaite synagogues I know in California. I believe there's a community in Egypt. Anybody who knows a bit more about Judaism, feel free to put this into the chat. It's not my area of expertise, although I did have a really fun experience taking a class on Karaism recently. Um, Karaite coming from Kuf Resh Aleph, which is the root of the word to read or to recite, um, really going back to Kra, to scripture, as opposed to rabbinic thought. But anyway, that's a sidebar. Basically, the Torah doesn't specifically delineate when we start counting, and it doesn't actually delineate a day for Shavuot. In Rabbinic Judaism, which is what the vast majority of us practice, um, we start counting on what we understand to be the day after the first day of Pesach, so starting on the night of the 16th of Nisan, to the fifth day of Sivan, which gets us to 49 days, 7 complete weeks of counting. And therefore, Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, happens on the 50th day, which is in our calendrical count, the 6th of Sivan. So it's really interesting that the Torah in our chapter here does not delineate a specific day. It just lets us know we need to have a celebration in these particular ways and bring this offering. And so the rabbis had to fill that in for us. And so now we take it for granted that, of course, Shavuot is on the 6th of Sivan and on the 7th, if you are in communities that keep 2 days. And you count from the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Passover, through the 5th of Sivan. So it's an interesting thing I just wanted to explore because the Torah doesn't delineate exactly. Whereas, as we're going to go forward in our chapter, we get specific dates for Rosh Hashanah, and we get specific dates for Yom Kippur. Although, even in the case of Rosh Hashanah, we don't actually have a it's not here called Rosh Hashanah. It's actually here called, and I'm skipping over a little bit of really important things about harvest, which we're going to go back to in a minute. But if we're thinking about Rosh Hashanah, that on the first day of the seventh month, we are to have the Shabbaton, Zikaron Truah, Mikra Kodesh. It's this term Zikaron Truah, the remembrance of these blasts. Don't do any melacha. Don't work at any of your occupations, is often how it's translated. You could also sort of understand this as don't do any creative labor. And we're told here that, we've got our particular sacrificial offerings, which is similar to what we've had earlier in Leviticus. But we also have a remembrance here or a note here that this day of Rosh Hashanah involves loud blasts of the shofar, which when we get there, and especially in Elul, we'll start talking a lot more about, why and what does the shofar evoke and all of these things. And then we have a little bit of a mention of Yom Kippur on the 10th of the seventh month. Um, and I'm gonna once I talk for a second about Sukkot, I'm actually gonna circle back to the very beginning of this chapter. There is a significant amount of there's a significant amount of space given in this chapter, which is why I think this is often which is why I think this is the reading for Sukkot, to talk about Sukkot and the different aspects of it, and taking the four species and celebrating for 7 days. And what's interesting is that this chapter really presents us a liturgical year beginning with Nisan. A lot of times we think of the Jewish year as beginning with Tishrei, the seventh month, but in fact it begins with Nisan, as is evidenced here in this chapter, and Rosh Hashanah falls actually in the seventh month, which it's interesting, right? Because it's the seventh month of the liturgical year, but the first month of the calendar year. And the way that I often describe this to folks is that it's like how in secular contexts, you can have multiple New Years. the first day of school, a fiscal year beginning in July 1st, any number of things, the civil calendar starting over in January 1st, like all those things. So too does the Jewish calendar have that. And I'm gonna pause there um, to invite if there are any comments in the chat about this particular calendar and why it's landed here and um, how we go about it.
Rabbi Tuchman, there was a question about the origins of the counting of Sfirat HaOmer with the Kabbalistic Sfirot, and where and when that tradition emerged.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Um, and thank you for that question because I want to kind of clarify a little bit about what I said about Sfirata Omer because as I was speaking, I was realizing it may not have been so clear. So I'm going to sort of redo that, and then in the process of doing that, I'm going to say a word about the Kabbalistic Sfirot. So the Sfirata Omer, the way it's described here in the Torah, this is where we get information about that. I think it does come up again in Deuteronomy, but here is where we get the greatest explanation and exploration of it. So we have 7 full weeks of counting. So today, as we're speaking, it's Lag BaOmer, so the 33rd day. Now, why is it called Lag? Because Lamed in Hebrew is equivalent to 30, and Gimel in Hebrew is equivalent to 3. So we are in the 33rd day of the Omer, which is 4 weeks and 5 days. So we have a number of days remaining. And traditionally, one does not say how many days are remaining of the Omer. We are counting upward. So with that, the question arises of like, how do you count? And in our portion today, the assumption, right, if you were to look at the literal text, is well, you count from the first Shabbat after Passover. That's simple enough. Like, okay, if Passover began on, a Friday night, that's super easy because then you just start counting on Saturday evening because that's after the first Shabbat of Passover. But if Passover fell on a Monday, you'd have to wait almost a full week to start counting. And that's how the Karaites, as I understand it, I could be incorrect, I'm not an expert in this, that's how the Karaites count the Omer, which is why Shavuot for them is not necessarily on the same day as it is for Rabbinic Jews, which are the vast majority. So Rabbinic Jews understand that we count the Omer beginning on the night of the second day of Passover because all festival days are, in some sense, rest days, whether they fall on Shabbat or not. So how did we end up, given we've got these 49 days, how did we end up with this Kabbalistic assignment of different emanations of the tree of life with each day of the Omer? I am not clear exactly when that started. My most educated understanding at this juncture is that that is part of the many innovations that came about through Rabbi Isaac Luria and the Sfat school of Kabbalah that arose in the 15th and 16th centuries in Sfat in the north of Israel. And my best understanding of that is that that thing got carried through to lots of different Hasidic communities. And even beyond that, I mean, there are lots and lots of people today who don't consider themselves to be either Kabbalists or Hasids in any way who are using these Kabbalistic assignments as part of their practice. That is certainly something that I have become more interested in the last few years. And just in brief, you may have, if you are counting the Omer this year, you may have come across this where each day has a particular assignment of Sfirot. So the lower 7, there are 10 Sfirot in the Kabbalistic tree of life, and each of the 7 weeks of that Kabbalistic tree was assigned a Sphira, beginning with Chesed and moving into Gevura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, which is where we are now, Yesod, and Malchut or Shechina, depending on how you want to understand the seventh Sphira. So I'll briefly try to translate those. Chesed, meaning kindness, and none of these translations, by the way, are particularly, they're not one for one translations, but they're the best we have. So said we can understand as loving kindness, Gevura as boundaries or strength, Tiferet as compassion, balance, splendor, Netzach as endurance or eternity, Hod as gratitude or release or glory in some way, Yesod meaning foundation, and then Malchut or Shechina, kingship, divine presence. So each of those 7 weeks then gets its own day. So like today is Hod, Shabbat. So it's gratitude within gratitude, and it's a whole schema that can kind of help people relate, I think, to this practice that otherwise, honestly, because we don't have the temple, because we're not making the kind of pilgrimage on Shavuot that used to happen, this practice would just not have resonance, I think, for a lot of people. And so the Kabbalists, I think, were actually really brilliant in taking it and fashioning it in a way for people to use as kind of like a parallel, honestly, to Elul, where in Elul we're thinking about our spiritual growth, and so too, I think, in this time as well. So I'll pause there.
Thanks for talking. There were a couple more questions that drift in. There are two that are sort of related. This one is from Yvonne, who asked if this is the only instance in the Torah where we count from one holiday to the next. And if that is the only one, why do we do it? And then sort of a similar question from Heidi, who says, in my Omer group, someone asked, but why count? What is it about counting that is so important?
Yeah, I love this. And as I'm responding to these, I would love for folks to drop in your own comments, and I'll pause in a moment if there are any that come in. So yeah, why count? Um, this is the as I am aware, this is the only holiday cycle in the Torah where we are actively counting from one to the next as a daily practice. And I can say more about what the practice of counting the Omer is like as well. So, why do we count? And this gets to a really beautiful question that arises for some in the Jewish tradition who ask the question, how is it that when you count the Omer, you say a blessing every day? It's the same blessing on counting the 49 days as understood as a single as a single mitzvah. So if it's understood as a single mitzvah, why do I need to specifically bless each day? Why not just say on the first day of the Omer, for those of us who have two Seders at the Seder, um, make the blessing, and that's it. It covered me for 7 weeks, right? Because there's also an understanding that even though this is a singular mitzvah, it actually also is 49 distinct mitzvot, because every day is distinct. And why are we counting? Well, because um back in the time when the Torah was when it came into being, in all the ways that it came into being, um, this really was an opportunity where we actually were actively bringing these offerings every day. We were actively bringing a wave offering. And Omer is a measure of barley. So we were actively bringing that new grain because Pesach was the time when we got rid of all the old, right? We got rid of all of the chametz, had to get rid of everything. And then we have the 7 days of absolutely no chametz to be eaten, to be benefited from, to have anything to do with chametz for 7 days. And then you start the cycle over again, right? And so that new grain gets brought every day. And I think that that's really why, in the time of the Torah, that's why the counting happened. It was really deeply connected to the agricultural cycle. I think today, when that piece of this is not present in our lives in the same way, um, counting can be an act of its own, I believe, deep spiritual meaning because Shavuot, and this is a really good moment to name that we have nothing in our chapter about Shavuot being the holiday of Matan Torah, of the receiving of Torah, the revelation of Torah. That is later on, and it's now so attached to Shavuot that we take it totally for granted. But the Torah here doesn't. The Torah here assumes that Shavuot is this incredible celebration of harvest. It's an incredible celebration of the new crop, but it's nothing about Torah. So the rabbis, when the temple no longer stood, you had this pilgrimage festival, Shavuot, that was really hard to figure out what to do with because Passover, we're still eating matzah. Sukkot, we're still able to build Sukkot and rest in them for 7 days. But if you're not bringing a wave offering of barley to the temple every day, well, then what do you do with this 50th day called Shavuot? And so the counting then also had to be transformed, I think, from an technical practice of I'm going to count these days until this harvest to a way of spiritually preparing for revelation of Torah. And the act of preparing oneself through that counting, I think, is really significant and perhaps needed more because, and again, this is my drash on it, like, it could, there's lots of different ways to understand it, but when we're in the month of Elul, and I think of Elul as a really good parallel, when we're in the month of Elul, we're all like the feelings in the air, like, yeah, Rosh Hashanah is coming, the season of Chagim is on the horizon. Getting ready for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, and Chal Torah, the whole thing. And with Shavuot, it's a little bit of a different situation because the anticipation, I think, isn't there in the same way. And so there's brilliance, I think, in taking this period of time and bringing new ways of understanding it, because otherwise, I think it'd be very easy to just kind of miss this entirely. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Rabbi Tuchman. This has sparked a little bit of a back and forth. There's
Mhm.
a couple of things drifting in that I'll read to you.
Yeah, please.
Marjorie offers that her understanding is that we're preparing our souls to receive the Torah, and that we need time to grow ready each day, and that's why we count.
Hmm.
Susie comments, doesn't isn't 49 the number of days from crossing the Red Sea until Mount Sinai? And then Paul offers that we actually do count many things to decide when Jews do things. Numbers are very important. Each letter has a numerical value. Chai is 18, and a bris happens on the eighth day. Maybe that's good for the moment.
Yeah, so for sure, numbers in Judaism are really, really important, as was named there. Um, Absolutely the case that we really value. I mean, we've got cycles of seven. We're going to look at that in next week's Parsha. We've got, Chai is 18. And yes, every Hebrew letter has a numerical equivalent. The counting of the Omer, though, is the only time in the Torah where we are actively counting the days between one holiday and the next. So it is certainly the case that numbers come up all the time in lots of different contexts. Um, yes, for sure. I think that that's exactly what I was describing with the Kabbalists. They were really focusing on preparing the soul for revelation of Torah and that we need each day to prepare. The rabbis did ultimately determine that it was 49 days from the crossing of the Yam Suf to Mount Sinai, which is why Shavuot became associated with revelation of Torah. Shavuot became associated with this is the day, especially if you look at Exodus 19, it does talk about the third month and traveling in the desert in the third month. So the rabbis kind of calculate out, well, that had to have been Sivan, which is the month of Shavuot, which is how we ended up with the association between Shavuot and the giving of Torah at Sinai. Shavuot is the holiday where we are actively observing. Wait, sorry about that. My water just fell. We are actively observing the excuse me, the revelation of Torah at Sinai together, and it's this larger cycle. Um, Part of this larger cycle of moving from Pesach, moving from that place of freedom to a place of becoming a people, a nation with Torah. So yes, that is very much part and parcel of the rabbinic understanding of Shavuot, for sure. Great. I will pause again and I'll just give folks a minute to, why don't we pause just a minute and let folks kind of write as they will into the chat, and I'll turn it to Ben in 1 second.
I think we're sort of tapped out on the chat, Rabbi Tuchman. There's
Sort of
about,
tap that on the chat.
I think we might be for now. Yeah.
That's great. If anything does come through, feel free to let me know. I can say a couple of other comments about Sukkot, or if there are any other things that people are curious about around about counting the Omer in particular. Um, it's a very interesting practice, actually, of counting the Omer. We'll stay there for a minute, and I'll invite if anybody wants to share any personal reflections. Actually, that could be really interesting to hear in the chat if anybody has any reflections on your own practice of counting the Omer, if it's something that you've done, if it's something that you have done less of. So feel free to do that as I'm speaking, and then we'll pause in a few moments if those come in. So counting the Omer is a really beautiful practice in lots of ways because it's one of those practices that we see the roots of in our parsha, and we get to experience the innovativeness of the ways in which the rabbinic tradition took a practice that otherwise probably would have fallen out of fashion entirely and created a system, as we've talked about, for understanding the days as connected to these Kabbalistic ideas, but also as understanding, it might seem to folks, and certainly was for me for many years, and still is in lots of ways, like a lot of the Sefirot are kind of abstract. And so it's like, okay, so what does Hod Shebahod mean, right? And I'm using that as our example because today, as we're together in this space, it is Lag BaOmer, Hod Shebahod. And Hod Shebahod, this gratitude and gratitude, well, what does that mean to connect to? How does one really work with both of those things in tandem? So I think a lot of times we're trying to figure that out. And every teacher that I have encountered who has either written on counting the Omer or has their own practice around it, like there's so many different modern ways in. You've got, there's a Omer calendar of biblical women. There are books on spiritual growth during the Omer. There are books on poetry during the Omer. Like all these different things to try to make this time more multifaceted. And I also think that there's something really beautiful about remembering where it actually came from. So many, many Shavuots ago, I was on a retreat at Isabella Friedman Jewish Retreat Center in Connecticut. And we actually had what we called a Bikurim parade, which I'd never done before, but it was a really interesting ritual where we all paraded from the synagogue on that campus, which if folks have not been there, it's a really beautiful space to be. We all went from there down to the farm. And actually, there was a space that was kind of set aside where people actually put stalks of wheat that we were carrying. And in a certain way, it was allowing this 7 week period to really find a new valence and reminding ourselves that this entire calendrical cycle that we've explored together is really very, very earth based. Ultimately, all of these holidays that we've looked at today are tied in some way to the cycles of harvest. And that parade, which was both kind of hokey and a little fun. I've done it once. I don't know that I would do it. It wasn't really my cup of, Jewish ritual tea, but that's okay. Like I was so glad to be able to do it. And it was really an experience of like, oh, let's actually like bring this into a different modality, into a different way of learning and doing. Um, and so I think that that's largely what's happening with this practice of counting the Omer is that we're trying to do that in lots of different ways. I have a teacher right now who's inviting people to journal every day of the Omer. I know people who there's a beautiful Omer Nikun by Yosef Goldman, and I sing that pretty often when I'm counting. So there are lots of different ways. And so too with the other holidays, there are lots of different ways that we are continuing those forward in the absence of, in the case of Leviticus, there was no temple, it would have been the Ohel Moed, but in the absence of that place of meeting, that pilgrimage structure, we as a Jewish tradition have been amazingly resilient and adaptive to keep our traditions going, to keep enlivening them with new meaning and new practice. And so that happens with Sukkot. People can make Sukkot in lots of different ways and lots of different spaces. It even though we're not making pilgrimage in the same way, people are still able to spend that holiday in Sukkot and thinking about Pesach in the same way. So I think that that can be one of the many lessons we take from this chapter is the ways in which this calendar is both so deeply central and it's a way of finding ways to stay connected and resilient and adaptive to many different circumstances that have arisen in the collective experience of the Jewish people. I think it is also notable to name that the first holiday mentioned in our chapter, which I kind of skipped over in the beginning and shouldn't have, but the first holiday mentioned, of course, is the most important, Shabbat, every single week. And this chapter also includes, this is just a sidebar, but includes some of the verses that are said as part of Kiddush on festivals. So there are blessings that we say to sanctify Shabbat and sanctify festivals, and that's called Kiddush, sanctification. And so the rabbis took from sections of Torah that talk about the festivals and brought those verses into the Siddur. So that's also just a fun liturgical tidbit. Um, I think we'll move us to closing in a few minutes, but before we do, let me turn it back over to Ben if there's anything interesting in the chat.
Yeah, we're down to our last 5 minutes or so, but there's been a couple folks just sharing some of their own resources or reflections about the counting of the Omer. There's a couple folks who have noted that it's just very difficult to remember. So there's been some sharing
Mm,
of resources, including I'll just plug my Jewish Learning's own resource. We have a daily email that folks can subscribe to. And Natasha shared that she's been enjoying Dance of the Omer by Rav Benji Elson, that she highly recommends. Rachel shared that she was taught that the bridge between Passover and Shavuot is that there needs to be a connection. One holiday is about freedom, and the other one is about law. That freedom without law and law without freedom is meaningless. I was also taught
mm,
that. Susie
hmm
shared that she is counting for the first time, and she likes reading the lessons from Chabad and meditations from Rabbi Sachs. I assume that's Jonathan Sachs, but that she's not quite emotionally connected to the practice yet. Someone noted the link that some people find between Omer and Advent in Christian
mm.
tradition.
Huh.
Desiree is reading a poem a day in a book, This is the Day by Diane Elliott. I'm not familiar with that, but Rabbi Elliott does write for My Jewish Learning sometimes, so I'm sure that's wonderful. And Naomi also noted that her mother compared counting of the Omer in weeks and days to counting the days of a pregnancy. That's interesting. So that's just a little sample of what's trickling in there.
Yeah, well, thank you for all of that. Those are really, really beautiful reflections. And I'm always happy to, those resources are wonderful. There's so many things out there. Um, And yeah, like kol hakavod to anyone who's counting for the first time. That's fantastic. Um, it can be really, really hard to remember. Absolutely. And like I'll just totally I'll say to end that, there's certain traditions that have like a very long like order of things you say to count the Omer. It's like if you've seen the Chabad app, for example, there's like a some of the verses from our Parsha, and then the blessing, and then the actual count, and then there's a psalm and Anabakach and lots of stuff following that. And a lot of people just make the blessing and say the day and the week. So, like I always encourage folks to, the most important thing is to remember to count. And so I know in my own practice, like there's some days when I say more of the additional stuff, and there are many, many more days when I just remember to count the number. So, just to totally name that, like we're all on this journey together. Um, and I think also another thing to note, yes, I very much agree that there is a connection between, freedom without law is meaningless and law that, all of that. I think that's key. But also, this is a parallel cycle to Tishrei. So it's just that in Tishrei, everything is really bunched together. So if we think about Shavuot as kind of being equivalent to Shmini Atzeret, it's actually very similar. It's just that the difference we have 7 weeks in between, as opposed to in Tishrei when everything is crammed into 3 weeks. But there is a certain way in which the cycle begins and the cycle ends. And the Jewish calendar is really bookended. Every 6 months, we have a significant holiday cycle. And one of the nice things I think about the cycle we're in right now is that it's slower. And so as we count each of these days, we have a little bit more breathing room, a little bit more spaciousness than we do when the Chagim hit in the fall. And going from Rosh Hashanah immediately to Yom Kippur, immediately to Sukkot, it's like you don't have time to catch your breath. So I think that this is also kind of giving us that break. Um, so I know I've said a lot this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you all for joining us. It's really a delight to be here with you. Thank you for trying this new, more emphasis on the chat. I look forward to teaching again with My Jewish Learning really soon. I'll just turn it back to Ben if you have any words of closing.
I don't, just to thank you, Rabbi Tuchman, and thank everybody for joining us. We'll be back next week at this time. In the meantime, have a Shabbat Shalom and take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Take care, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.